Welcome back. We are now at episode 5 or 6? 4? 5. I don't remember which episode we're on, but we're back, and I'd like to thank today's fake sponsor. Do you refuse to have garbage just sitting outside your office? Well, call Northwest Refuse, and they'll refuse to pick up your garbage. Ask for Zach. I want to pick up where we left off. Quick recap. We talked about the associative property of a father's brain being responsible for the creation and nurture of a son's brain and body. We talked about that process briefly. Just a recap. Father decides it's time to have a child. Drop of semen forms in the womb. My 13-year-old is having a great time listening to this right now. And that forms in the mother's womb, in the uterus for 9 months, and develops all sorts of body parts and organs and limbs, etc., until the child is born. And once a child is born, the child's brain forms, is responsible for all the processes in the body. So the son's limbs and digestive system and nervous system, everything is controlled by the brain of the child, all the way down to its toenails. The toenail growth in the child is dependent on brain activity. Therefore, you can say that the toenails of the son are actually in existence and sustained and maintain a connection to the brain of the father. Because if not for the father's brain thinking and having that thought to create the child, then the toenails would not exist in the child. And so by associative properties, the son's toenails are created by and sustained by the brain of the father via the brain of the son. Okay, let's talk about why this is important. Throughout all of history, there's been millions and millions of Jewish people, and their souls all have different levels. Some are the leaders of the Jewish people, some are scholars, some are businessmen, some are simple folks. And at the end of the day, all of Bnei Israel, all the Jewish people, make up one body, so to speak, where you have the heads of each generation who act as the brains, and you have everything in between all the way to the toenails. Meaning the simplest Jew is still a Jew, is still created by the same source as the leader of the generation, meaning the brain of the father. In this case, the father is God. God thought to create Jewish souls. And God's thought, anthropomorphically speaking, is very different than man's thought. Man can have a thought, it can be fleeting, it disappears. He uses it to think something, speak something, do something, and then it's gone. With God's wisdom, God's knowledge, and God's thought, there is no separation, because as Maimonides, Rambam writes, that God is the knowledge, the knower, and the known, which is not something that any human being can understand, because it's not possible to understand with our limited brains how it's possible to know something that isn't you and also be it, because that's not how we're made. But God created from within himself, as we said. He blew from within his innermost in order to create us. So when he thinks to do something and then does it, and then that thing exists, it's all actually part of God. So he knows himself and everything around because there's nothing other than him, which is a very difficult concept for us to understand. But you just have to accept that as a fact from Rambam Maimonides. Therefore, God thought to create us. So he is the brain of the Father. And his thought said, okay, I'm going to create and form all of these souls. Now, these souls have all these different grades and levels, and we'll talk about how they descend into this world to become embedded in actual bodies in order to live in this world. However, Some are loftier, some are less lofty. It doesn't matter. They all are formed because God, Hashem, decided to create Jewish souls. So at the very initial root core, they're all created the same. Meaning there was a brain, it decided to form the child. What happens through the process? Babies all look different. Some are bigger, some are smaller, different color hair, bald, whatever it is, they're all formed differently in the womb. And so too by the souls of the Jewish people. We all are formed differently through this process, which we'll talk about it soon. However, the bottom line is that the foundation of all of it is that we're all created by God's thought to create us. So there's that unifying aspect that all the souls are one. All have that same root essence of our creation. Now, throughout the world and throughout history, like we said, there's different grades of levels. Some people are the brain of the generation, i.e. Moshe Rabbeinu, the forefathers, all of the Tanya and the Amoraim, all of these people, the leaders of every generation, are the brain of the generation. Now, the brain of the generation resembles the brain of the father most closely. If you're going to take any of the body parts from the son and say, which of these body parts resemble his father, you would say, okay, well, the brain has the most obvious tie to the father. And when you look at someone's features and you look at their face, which are elevated higher up on their body, you say, oh, he looks like his father. She looks like her mother. But the formation of the brain in the child is most closely connected to the brain of the father, as opposed to saying, okay, well, that child's toenails are connected to the father. Yeah, they are. Bottom line, if you go all the way back, they are. But you'd have to first associate the toenails of the child to the brain of the child, and then go from brain to brain. So it's very obvious that the brain of the child is most closely associated to the brain of the father. Why is that important? Because though there are many spiritual levels of all the souls of Bnei Israel, of the Jewish people, there are clear heads of the Bnei Israel, of the generation. And those heads are the brain of the generation and most closely associated with the brain of the father. Meaning, the tzaddikim, the righteous people, the leaders of every generation, have the closest resemblance to the brain of the father, which is God, because it was his wisdom who decided to create us. And if a guy like me is the toenail of my generation, or someone else is an elbow or a kneecap or a liver or whatever, they feed off of the brain just like a human body would. They feed and nurture off of the brain. Why is this important? Because in the way the downward influence or flow or spiritual sustenance comes to the Jewish people in this world is just like a body. The brain sustains all of the body parts. And practically speaking, on a spiritual level, every single Jewish soul in each generation derives its sustenance from the brain of that generation. Now, I know this is going to be controversial. A lot of people are going to freak out and message me and say, how could it be that we don't derive our sustenance directly from God? We can all pray to God. We can pray directly. We can ask for what we want. And that's true. And we have a direct connection to reach God from here upwards. But as far as how it comes downwards, and we'll get into this later, the flow of divinity that comes down here actually comes from the Father to the brain of the child, i.e. the righteous of each generation, the leaders of each generation. And from there, it is disseminated out to the people, all the different body parts. No matter what spiritual rung you're on the ladder, you get your sustenance from that, which is why it's very important to have spiritual leaders, and why in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers, it says to make yourself a Rav, make yourself a rabbi, and every generation has a leader and a Rebbe who is the Moshe Rabbeinu of each generation. We'll get into more of this a little bit later. I know this is a lot, and we reviewed a lot from before, but this is a concept that you must understand. It's been 10 minutes, so peace.